I actually feel a bit of pressure at the moment. There's been a really positive vibe at this conference. We've had charismatic Marco giving his talk, lots of happy jokes and conversations out there. And I've got to try and keep this vibe going until the end of the conference, set Paul up. So let's talk about phobias. Everyone's got phobias, right? Dentist, injections, snakes, spiders, flying heights. But my phobia is worse than all of those phobias and all of your phobias, because my phobia is introducing myself. I'm an introvert, I'm British, very modest, don't like talking about myself. It's very difficult when you're a public speaker to have this phobia. But I get the same from like CVs, LinkedIn profiles. It makes me cringe, it makes me feel very uncomfortable. I've had this problem for a very long time. But recently, it was cured, completely cured instantly by a random email I received, completely out of the blue. I was coming back from my French lesson, checked my phone, had an email from a name I didn't recognize, and it said this: "Hey Nick, I just stumbled across one of your videos, and I must say I'm really impressed. You're like a combination of Martin Fowler and Eminem." So when people say to me now, "When's your next book coming out?" I'm like, I'm past books. I'm working on a hip-hop album about DDD. So yeah, I thought that's probably as good a bio and intro I'll ever have, so I'm gonna own it, I'm gonna roll with it, and yeah, I'm gonna stand by this. Don't know if I can live up to those expectations, but let's see. I can tell you something a bit more tangible about myself. So I recently started working for a company called Navico, working in the marine electronics industry. It's not a domain I'm very familiar with, but there's lots of interesting opportunities here. If you came to the last talk about scanning depths and things, really interesting stuff. And we're hiring, so if you're looking for a new opportunity, exciting new domain, we are based in London and we are hiring. So I'd actually like to tell you now about some things that happened a bit further back in my career. And I think most of you can recognize this story where you're working in a particular company and the cycles are very long. You spend like 2 or 3 weeks on a sprint. In this company, it was 3 weeks. So every 3 weeks, big bang deploy at the end of the sprint. Developers would spend like 2 days after manually regression testing everything. Very painful, very boring. But as a junior developer, I thought, well, this is normal, this is software, this is the process. And then I went to work for another company, and it was a little bit different. On my first day, I paired up with a senior developer. We wrote some tests, we wrote some code to make the test pass, and we clicked a button, and we deployed it to production. No manual regression testing, none of that stuff. And this is how it worked all of the time. 25 production deploys a day. And I was completely blown away by this. I thought, wow, this is amazing. But when I looked deeper and I started to ask, well, what's different about this company? Why are you working this way? And all of those other companies are working in a very different way. And it was basically a new manager came in and he said to the developers, look, we want to develop software the right way. We want to move faster. Make it happen. And the developers had the autonomy and they made it happen. So I learned here, the moral of the story is, when developers have autonomy, they can produce great things. But it can also produce bad things because I kind of got a bit overconfident. Like, oh, I've worked for this amazing company, I know everything about software, and I've kind of stopped learning. Sorry. So I thought I'd stop learning. I know everything, I work for this major company, I'm super arrogant and stuff. And I kind of stopped looking for learning opportunities. But a few years later, I was working for the UK government and I had another really profound learning opportunity. So I was working with 3 teams and each team had a user researcher. And every week, user research would go out, talk to some users, interview them, pretty standard stuff, except the user researchers would take developers. And those developers who didn't go with the user researcher would watch videos back in the office. And the interesting effect this had was the developers became motivated to actually solve user problems. They were contributing to the product roadmap. Why don't we test this feature out next week? Why don't we tweak this? Why don't we try this? And it had a massive impact. And I saw again, developers had the autonomy to talk to users, to choose the most important problem and to solve that problem. So again, autonomy was the answer. But as we started to work on more challenging projects, touching different parts of the organization, covering bigger areas, we started to hit a problem. So let me give you an example. On one of these projects, we were developing a new service for businesses. And the feedback we got from users was, your address field is 3 lines long, but my business address is 5 lines long, so I can't even register. I can't even get past the first step. I'm still stuck on paper. I can't even use your service. And we were like, yeah, we're autonomous, we've got the power to fix this, let's fix this problem. But actually we didn't have the autonomy because we needed back-end teams to update their API, data teams to update the schema, internal teams to update the internal applications. And so a week later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 5 project managers to put a text box on a web page. And it's kind of frustrating, but when you're working on these big transformation projects, you need to be patient. So I was a bit frustrated, but kept my patience. A month later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 5 project managers to put that text box on the web page. We're not making any progress. These teams are all too busy, they've got different backlogs, it's just not happening. And so, team lost motivation. We've got this user problem, we just can't solve it. We don't have the autonomy to solve it. And this kept happening over and over again. Teams didn't have the autonomy to implement those end-to-end solutions, and people just eventually left. Most people left. And so that's the other side of autonomy. When teams don't have autonomy, the results aren't so great. Now, this is all anecdotes, but we have data now. So Nicole Forsgren and Jess Humble, Gene Kim, they've been doing those DevOps surveys for the past, I think it's like 5 or 6 years. And they recently launched a book where they collated all their findings, gave some nice clear summaries, and actually what they found is a loosely coupled software architecture and an organizational structure to match is one of the biggest predictors of continuous delivery performance, which in itself is a predictor of organizational performance. So when we talk about DDD and bounded contexts, that literally is one of the most important things you can do to improve the capabilities in your organization. Now, ThoughtWorks, they've done some studies too, and what they found is when a piece of work leaves a team, when 2 teams must collaborate on a feature or piece of work, it takes an order of magnitude longer to complete that work. Now, in my story, with the 5 project managers and the text box, I don't know how many orders of magnitude longer that took to complete, but it's far too many. So a classic example there, supporting this data. So we talk about autonomy, we say it's important, but it's not easy to get autonomy right, as I found in the UK government. And I have worked in a few companies that feel a little bit too much like this. So it's hard to get autonomy right, and we often see stories about, similar to this one. This company, they went from a monolith to microservices, they got their boundaries completely wrong, and back to microservices, back to a monolith. So they rewrote their system twice. Doesn't sound very effective to me, and I'm sure they would have rather not wasted their time doing that. So I'd like to start off today by looking at some of the fundamental challenges and patterns and some of the obvious things that we can start looking at to avoid making some of the common mistakes. And so one of the first things is this idea of autonomy. You get people like me writing books and blog posts about this magic autonomy stuff, but it's not like pixie dust. It's not like you sprinkle it on your teams and they suddenly have autonomy and they can do anything, they can fly. It just doesn't work that way. Because think about autonomy. I'm giving you autonomy to make a decision or to own a piece of your system. But that means someone else isn't making that decision. Someone else doesn't own that piece of software anymore. And so you've taken autonomy away from them. And so looking at this more concretely, one example is where we assume all parts of a system have equal value. In the DDD community, I think we're quite good with this. But what this can lead to is we have systems where high-value things and low-value things are coupled together. So as a business, we want to improve a certain part of our code base where there's a big return on investment. But to do that, we have to navigate parts of the code that have less value or maybe no value. But what we'd like to do is align by value. We'd like to spend our time where payback is greatest and not have to be bogged down by bits of the code that don't have any value. They're just slowing us down when we're changing it. So this is the first primary heuristic I'd like to share with you today. When you're designing systems, I want you to think about aligning things with value. But it's not the only one. And there's a caveat. If we get too focused on value, we can create a system with lots of dependencies. Very often, high-value things are coupled to low-value things. The low-value things support the high-value things. So there will be some dependencies there. So we can't look too closely at just this one heuristic. Another anti-pattern is where we create arbitrary or naive boundaries. Let me give you an example, and I reckon a few people might have seen this anti-pattern a few times before. This code base sucks. This old code base sucks. We need a new code base. All the new code will live in the new code base, and we won't touch the old code base. And I was talking to a company who had this problem, and they had a project team. The project team came along, created a nice new code base, finished their project, like, right, we're done. We've got our project over the line. The next project came along, new team was started, and every time they wanted to touch the new code base, now they had to touch the old code base as well. So they had double the problems because there were still dependencies between those things. So here's our next heuristic. Align with your business domain. I'm sure most people here have an interest in doing this already. So what can we look at next? Let's think about the size of things. So it's very easy to say, let's have lots of small things, lots of small microservices owned by very small two-pizza teams, which is great. It gives us very, very simple local complexity. So each piece in isolation is very simple. A team owns a small piece, they can focus on this piece, and it keeps their cognitive load low. But now the complexity moves to the global level because we have lots of pieces and lots of interactions between them. And if we think back to ThoughtWorks, where a piece of work leaving a team takes an order of magnitude longer to complete, if we have lots of small pieces, the chance of two pieces changing together is higher, and so we go back to that order of magnitude potentially. But if we go the other way and we have big pieces and big teams, now we run the risk of burnout. So I don't know if you've worked on a big team with like 15 to 20 developers, but stand-ups take a long time, very long time. And also you're constantly getting bombarded with notifications. There's always something going off in Slack. There's always a pull request to review. It's hard to know what everyone else in your team is working on, but because they're in your team, you feel like you have to know, and you try and keep up with what they're working on. So it can burn out. And also, architecture is politics. So think back to the example I gave you about the UK government. This is slightly hypothetical, because I don't want to get sued, but there were two different departments in the organization. There were digital. We own all the front-end stuff. And the enterprise IT guys, folks, they own the back-end stuff, which kind of seems fine at first glance. But now we're saying we want to have autonomous teams who own end-to-end slices. How do we do that here? If we do that here, one of those managers is going to lose their power, because in an organization, managers very often want to increase their headcount. That improves their chances of getting promoted. And so when we design systems, there are political consequences to the choices we make. Now, there are better ways of solving this problem at an organizational level, but when these boundaries are entrenched in the organization and beyond your control, yeah, you just have to be aware of it. You can't really change it. And I like to call this the Game of Thrones heuristic, which is basically, whenever you're designing a system, keep in mind that everyone wants to become moving to the next level, And is your design, are you taking power away from someone? If you are, you might have a hard time against these people. And I actually recently saw a great example of this heuristic. It's not from IT, but there are many analogies here to an IT example. So Bunnings is a big Australian company. They have like big stores for big garden stores. Like I was recently laying a patio in my garden. I bought these like massive spades from there. But Bunnings, they wanted to come to the UK. They bought a branch of stores called home-based stores. And they were going to turn them into Bunnings stores. And they had an idea. They were like, let's do this in a gradual way. Let's not do a big bang deploy. Let's start small. Let's try it on a couple of different stores and iterate until we find something that works, which makes sense with software. But Bunnings gave their managers in the UK high levels of autonomy. Like, yeah, you guys figure stuff out. We trust you. Do it how you want to. But the problem was, at the same time, there was a contest in the organization to become the next CEO. So all the managers in the UK were like, I can't wait until my turn. I need to turn into Bunnings now to be a success story because I want to be the CEO. That's the Game of Thrones heuristic, and this happens in software companies a lot too. So the third primary heuristic I want to talk to you about today is optimizing for social needs. When you're creating boundaries in software, when you're talking about bounded context, think about all of the different social and political effects of those choices. Next one is about technical things. So the way we define boundaries in our system, we need to be aware of the technical constraints. So I worked in one organization, and we had these two different services. Each had its own database, and the users were complaining. When I look at your catalog, I see one price. When I add it to my basket, I see a different price, because we had eventual consistency there, because the choice of those boundaries had that impact. That's an example of a technical constraint. I'm sure you're probably aware of many technical constraints, so I don't want to dwell on that too much. And the last one is about UX. The way we design our boundaries and interact with UX is a very difficult problem. I think people are calling it now like the last mile of microservices. How do we do the UX? So we talk about the old ways, the front-end team, the front-end monolith. This is a bad thing. We need these vertical teams, which I kind of agree with. Then we start breaking our UI up into different pieces owned by separate teams. But now we've kind of moved the bottleneck. If we want to change our UX, we now need to involve all of these teams. And more importantly, it's very difficult to break a system up so that each page belongs to one specific bounded context. And what we end up is nowadays is things like micro front ends, which can give teams more autonomy, but now it's making a trade-off where it's harder to get the UX right. We have this one page which has logic and presentation from multiple different teams. There are ways to mitigate this, but it's very easy to create an inconsistent user experience here. And then we get to the next stage where we don't just have one UX. We have mobile apps and all different kinds of apps, and now we've got these bottlenecks back again anyway. Is it possible for one team to own a slice through every user experience? We get back to the global complexity, the bigger teams again. So the way we place boundaries has an impact on the UX, and there's no easy pattern to follow to find the right boundaries. So that's the fifth heuristic. It's about think about the user experience. Even when you're deep in the guts in the back-end stuff or your database, think about the user experience impact of the choices you're making. So in the rest of this talk, I'd like to touch on some of these different top-level heuristics and give a few examples. So the first one is about value. How can we use value to guide the design of our systems? So here's an example. I worked with a company who worked in the advertising technology space, or MarTech, or AdTech, or whatever they're calling it these days. The company started off and they had this advertising product for businesses. Enabled businesses to run advertising campaigns on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. But they actually started off with Facebook. And then one day, the sales team rushed in. We've just closed a massive deal for X millions. We need Twitter and LinkedIn support in like a ridiculous time frame. And the devs were like, yeah, okay, that's going to be a challenge. But they looked at Twitter, they looked at LinkedIn, and they thought, there's enough similarity there. We can create a nice generic model and have them all living in the same code base. And it worked. They beat the deadline, and they were heroes. They hit this big deadline. They were heroes in the company, major success story for a couple of weeks. Because the company's customers, they mostly cared about Facebook. Like, Facebook is the dominant social media for advertising. And that's where 95% of the company's revenue, I think about 95%, I might be slightly off there. But that's where most of the company's revenue came from. But now they had this generic code base, and every time they were trying to add new Facebook features, they were slowed down by the Twitter and the LinkedIn features. And with these new startups popping up, they just got way behind the competitors. This product was killed, and those people were fired. So they hit the deadline, they looked like heroes. But in the long term, it was a bad move. And that's why as software developers, we make like $1 million decisions all of the time. And sometimes in the short term, we may look like heroes. But in the long term, we're losing our company lots of money, and people's jobs might be at stake. That's why we need to understand value better. And so there are lots of heuristics you can think about in this category. I'm sure Matthias knows loads of them, but here's a couple of examples. So when we're looking for autonomy, try and find your core domains. This is why core domains really are important. Find the core domains and make sure you have autonomy there. But think about your organization's investment strategy and growth strategy. They can help you understand what the future looks like and avoid looking like a hero today and having the failure tomorrow. And at the other end of the scale, it's not always about having completely separate things with high autonomy. There's a balance between duplicating effort. So I worked with one of the biggest supermarkets in the UK. They had probably close to 100 teams, and most of those teams had built their own email templating system. And the company worked out, we're spending a lot of money on email templating services. Let's just have an email templating service owned by a single team, and everyone else can use this. That's quite an obvious example of where minimizing duplication makes sense, but it's quite difficult to find that. Should we have autonomy or should we minimize duplication? So I always recommend to people, understand your organization's business model. Try using the business model canvas. It's not a perfect tool, but it will help you build a mental model of thinking about value to your business. And I don't use this all of the time, but the things I've learned from the business model canvas are very, very influential to me. But when we talk about value, we need to be very careful, because it's not just about money. He was smiling about something there, sorry, he distracted me. It's not just about money. So let's think about like Google, for example. Like, you don't pay Google to use their search engine, that's free. But I'm pretty sure you could consider that's part of their core domain. If they didn't have an amazing search, you wouldn't use the product. But that's not how they make money. They make money through advertising. So value here can be different things. And there's often this trade-off where one part of the business says, our stuff is important because customers pay for it. But another part of the business says, well, our stuff is important because no one will use our product if we don't have this feature, even though it doesn't make money. And there are some patterns in here too. So one pattern that I've seen a few times is called the dog food context. And so everyone knows dog fooding, right? It's where you use your own products. Some people call it drinking your own champagne. But I think dog food is a lot more relevant to software. So I worked for a company some time ago now, quite a few years ago. They were building a media streaming platform. Let's say you wanted to build your own version of iTunes. You could use these APIs to like search for music, download music, stream music, add it to your catalog and stuff. But they built this platform and they had companies using it, but they also had a team internally who were building a product on top of their own platform. Now, the main goal of that team was not to make money. The main goal of that team, of this dog food context, was to understand how to build a product on top of this API, on top of this platform, to understand the limitations and how customers were feeling, and take that feedback and use that feedback to improve the core product. So now let's move on to the second one. Let's look at how we can look at our domain in different ways. So one of the important concepts here is, if we want teams to be autonomous, if we want them to own end-to-end slices or as close as we can possibly get, we need to reduce dependencies. It's those dependencies that reduce autonomy. If I depend on you, I don't have autonomy. I'm dependent on you. And we do that by understanding our domain, using event storming, domain storytelling to work out how these different concepts are related to each other and put boundaries around things that change together so we have few dependencies. And one of the interesting things about this is we often think coupling and cohesion is a technical constraint, but it's kind of not. So one example is the way we find boundaries in our system is often very ad hoc. There's no natural boundary in the real world you're looking for. And when you look closer, you can actually group different concepts in different ways. There are many valid ways to model a system. And the example I like to use is the supermarket. Have you ever been to the supermarket where you're looking for something and it's not where you expected it to be? So a few weeks ago, it was Sunday afternoon. My wife is a chef, so we had an amazing Sunday lunch. And I said, why don't we get a dessert or something? Let's try and get a thing called a Viennetta. I don't know if you have that here. I have not had one for years. And she says, let's get some squirty cream and some chocolate sauce. I'm like, right, shoes on, coat on, heading down to the shop to get some cream and chocolate sauce. And I get to the supermarket, and I head over to the dessert section. And there's no chocolate sauce. Okay, do they have any? Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's somewhere else. But where else could it be? Chocolate. Chocolate sauce is a chocolate. So I go to the chocolate section, and it's not there either. Okay, chocolate sauce? Sauce? Could it be with the sauces? Ketchup, barbecue, mayonnaise, Jamaican jerk sauce. I'm not seeing any chocolate sauce here. So I'm starting to worry, like, oh, maybe they just don't have any in stock. Then I see this guy who works in the shop, and he's looking real busy. He's got like Scotch eggs and pork pies like stacked up to his eyes. And I know he doesn't want me to disturb him, but I need my chocolate sauce. So I'm like, hey, where can I find the chocolate sauce? And he says, it's over by the ice cream, by the freezers. And he says that in like a really hurried way, like, I'm busy, leave me alone. And I think that can't be true, because there are no shelves down there. It's just freezers down there. There's nowhere to put the chocolate sauce. And I think he's like, I'm sure he's just told me a lie to get rid of me. And I'm seriously thinking about going to his manager and getting this guy fired. But I'm like, I'd probably better go down there first and check, just in case he is right. So I walk down there, and as I get there, I enter the aisle from the middle, and I can see at the other end, there's like this, an abandoned lunch trolley. I'm like, no way. So I walk down there, and this abandoned lunch trolley has some chocolate sauce on it. I've never seen that lunch trolley there in my life. And so I was telling this story to Sophie, one of my friends, Sophie, and she says, oh, let's call it the chocolate sauce heuristic. And I think this is really useful. When you're designing a system and you're trying to find boundaries, think of the chocolate sauce heuristic. What are all of the different possible ways I can take this one concept and group it with other concepts? So an example from software, moving back to things we're more familiar with now, recently had an opportunity to work with a financial products company. And they had this marketplace, and they had credit card deals, mortgage deals, loan deals. And at first, it looked like the boundaries were quite clear. We'll have a credit cards context, a mortgages context, a loans context. But if you look closer, you start to see patterns or stratifications, like a parallel hierarchies within those different contexts. And for example, there were high-end mortgage deals for people with lots of money, great credit rating, not me. And then there were other tiers, like a low value, like someone who doesn't have a credit rating, they've been bankrupt, really bad deals for those kind of people. And so now we've got two dimensions for grouping these concepts. How do we know which one is right? We don't really know which one is right. There's no perfect answer here. So if we go back to the example earlier of looking at the business model, if this company's business model was about servicing high-end customers. Like if 95% of their revenue came from high-end customers, then maybe it makes sense to go with the group things based on value. But if 95% of their revenue comes from credit card deals, then maybe it makes sense to go that way. And this is why when I talk about coupling and cohesion not being a technical thing, I mean it's based on your roadmap and your business model. What you plan to work on in the future will impact on those parts of your system which will change together. And also patterns. Understanding the patterns can help us to avoid some of these common mistakes. So there are typically two kinds of patterns I found. The first one is very process-oriented. We take some business process, we break it down into separate steps, and each step can be a bounded context. So going back to the advertising technology example, we might have the campaign builder, that builds the campaign, then we have a campaign executor that runs the campaign, analysis, and an optimizer. But we can also look at this domain from a capabilities point of view. And so one capability here would be creatives. So when you're looking at an advert online, the creative is the video, the picture, the text, the sound, that's the creative. We could group our context based on these capabilities. And now if we look at our business process steps, each step is now pulling in or coordinating different capabilities. And depending on the domain you work in, and even in different parts of the same domain, sometimes you might want to go process-oriented, and sometimes you might want to go capability-oriented. And so one of the patterns here is kind of like the entity lifecycle pattern, where some concept goes through different stages in its lifecycle. If you came to the last talk about the contract going through different steps, that's a good example of this. But this is quite a basic pattern. But the important thing here is to know about this pattern and to know about other patterns. So I had an opportunity to spend some time a while ago with a company who were building software for airlines. And one of the tools they had is, it basically starts off by taking all of the data about the routes your company can fly on. So let's say your company owns the rights to fly from London to Denver. It takes all of these legs and it converts them into routes, to journeys. And then the next step of their process, they work out which one of our planes will go on each one of these journeys, etc. And the third step is which staff, which crew members will be on each flight. So at first, they'd modeled this as an entity lifecycle pipeline, because that was how the business process worked. At each stage it was handed over to a different person in the business. And that looks like the business process. But this domain was different because things can change. The routing data can change. And if that changes, you have to recalculate it, then you have to recalculate your fleet and recalculate your crew. And in this business, because they'd gone for this model, and they said, right, whoever's got this schedule, let's call it, you've got to fix it. So if you're in the crew team and the data changes, you have to fix all of it. And so to do that, they had to have a separate rules context. And so all of these other steps now depend on the rules context. This becomes a bottleneck, and it becomes very tightly coupled to the other contexts. Whenever you're changing, you're nearly always changing two things together. But this domain fits the proposal pipeline, where if we have a concept, some data, a proposal, it can change. It can go back to a previous step at any time, which naturally fits this domain. And if we'd done that here, the rules context could have been broken up into different sets of rules that belong to a single place. So these are quite basic examples of patterns, but I think the example is quite powerful. If you start to understand the different kinds of patterns, you won't stop at the first obvious or naive solution. And again, we get back to the 5 heuristics. So each of these patterns will have technical, economical, and political consequences. So one example is the octopus context. So an example of this is, are you familiar with GDPR here? So GDPR, I was working at a company implementing GDPR. We had this GDPR context. Gets a notification. Delete all the data you have for customer XYZ. GDPR context reaches out to all these other contexts and says, delete the data you have for this customer and send me a notification when you've done it so I can keep an audit log. Now, what might be some of the common challenges we notice with this pattern? So firstly, in our example, someone said, why don't we put a message queue on each service, and the octopus can send a message to each of those services. And that sounds good at first. Keep it asynchronous, more fault tolerant, you can retry stuff. But then we had people saying, well, we don't have a message queue, and we don't really want to maintain a message queue. And every time I create a new service, I don't have to deal with the message queues. And so we looked at this and we inverted the problem. We put all of that logic inside the GDPR context, and it enabled each of those separate services to be simpler. And this is an example of where I also think, and not just this pattern, but patterns like this where you have lots of dependencies, where you have an interface that's depended on by many people, spending some time up front to get that design right can be extremely productive in the long run, because if you have a contract or an API and you have 10 or more teams depending on it, if you've got your design wrong and you want to change that, you now need 10 teams to update to your latest version. And think about some of the examples from earlier. That can be a very painful and political process. So yeah, let's talk about the others now. I've got a quick example of how we might need to balance these different heuristics, because that's the key here. None of these heuristics is always the correct answer. And in fact, very often it's a trade-off between many of them. So firstly, if we want to design effective systems, when we think about the social aspects, we need to remember that developers are not fungible resources. We don't just put them in a room and make them type stuff. I'm pretty sure most of you know that, so don't want to spend too much time there. But this leads us to an interesting heuristic called the Dan Pink heuristic, which I think, did you come up with this one? No, I've seen it somewhere. And basically, Dan Pink wrote this book about, for people to be happy, productive, and motivated, they need purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And that's a good heuristic for us when we're designing systems. How can we design systems so that people have purpose, autonomy, and mastery? And one example where you can get this wrong, or one challenge of this which is hard to get right, is when we have tiered systems. So the further someone is away from the end user, the harder it is for them to understand why a feature is important. And we get this anti-pattern, I think, is called selfish silos. So thinking back to my story about the 5 project managers trying to get this end-to-end feature implemented, we were very close to the customer. We understood the user's pains intimately, and we were motivated to solve them. But when we got to these back-end teams, we thought they were selfish. They didn't want to help us. They didn't want to solve the customer problem. But that was because they didn't understand the customer problem. They were too disconnected, and they were judged on different kinds of metrics. And so this is important when we're designing systems. What can we do to minimize that gap to the end user? How can we maybe reduce a few of those layers in the system? But not always. And so there's a bunch of other sub-heuristics in this category. For example, minimize social complexity we talked about earlier. Minimize the number of communication paths within a team to avoid burnout. And also, one thing I get some criticism for sometimes is I talk about these boundaries, I talk about autonomy, and it's like, but these perfect autonomy boundaries just don't exist. And that's completely right. They don't exist, and you probably wouldn't want that anyway. You want the different parts of your system to work together. You want your different teams to work together. And so there are patterns we can use here. We typically take the people to the work. So if I'm blocked on your team, instead of me waiting for your team to implement a change, I can create a pull request to your code in a sourcing. But this can be a very difficult pattern to make work if I don't understand how your team works and your team's code base and conventions and patterns. So we can use other resilience patterns, like regular cross-team pairing, where every month one person from your team rotates with a person from another team, and they pair up, and they learn some things about that team's system, that team's software. Now, when the time comes to do inner sourcing, you know about their code. It's the leap, the step up to make a change in their code base is much lower. And we can take that pattern even further. And I know a couple of companies that have done this, where people regularly rotate between teams and stay there. There's a fantastic book you can read on this topic called Dynamic Reteaming. I'm very, very enthusiastic about this book and the ideas in this book. There are a number of other patterns you can look at. Some interesting stuff about examples where organizations just said, look, we need to achieve these goals. Developers go form some teams and fix it. And the developers formed their own teams. They chose what team they wanted to work in, and they got the work done. So lots of interesting ideas in there, which I think are definitely relevant to DDD. So I just want to finish up now by thinking about how do we balance all of these different constraints and heuristics. So I think firstly, if you want to be better at designing systems and architecting them, I think patterns and heuristics are something you should care about deeply. Giving yourself different perspectives of a system, teaching yourself to look at a problem in different ways. And as some examples, these are some topics I've been learning about recently. Org design, social dynamics, financial intelligence. I don't even understand how accounting works. I thought it was just, yeah, didn't interest me. What was that?
You're human.
But actually, it's an interesting topic. We think accounting is just people playing with numbers. I'm not human, by the way. It's just people playing with numbers. But then you realize accountants have all of these kind of interesting, crazy tricks they can play with, CapEx and OpEx, and putting things in different places and depreciation. And that can help you understand value. And when you're designing software systems, that can be extremely useful knowledge. So yeah, learn to look at systems from different perspectives. I think those 5 primary heuristics, that's my mental model. That always keeps me on my toes to try and make sure I'm looking at it from different topics. But I think really importantly is that as system designers and builders, you are going to make like $1 million decisions like we talked about earlier. But it's actually a choice if you want to be aware of making those $1 million decisions. If you want to know the consequences of your choices when you're designing systems, then you need to be able to look at a system from all of those different perspectives. And I'm done now. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Thanks, Nick. That was fantastic. That octopus pattern, would you go one step deeper into that? Because I realized that I didn't understand actually the heuristic that was at play, or exactly how you solved it by moving things back into the octopus, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah, so in this example, it was a GDPR context. So a notification comes in from a customer, and you have to delete all of their data. So the GDPR context would go to all of these different services in the organization, which each have their own data store, and say, delete all the data you have for customer XYZ, and send me a notification back, because I need to keep an audit log, because when we get taken to court, I need some kind of proof. So that's the pattern where one context reaches out and touches many other contexts. And the example I gave here was, there was an interface that was consistent with all of those different services. And so there were 2 things I said, actually. The first one was, at first, we wanted to put a message queue on each of those services. And then the octopus would send a message, and it would all be asynchronous. But then we had teams saying, well, we don't have a message queue. We're not using messaging, and it's kind of overweight operational costs we don't have yet. It's kind of a big thing for us. It will slow us down. And we also thought about, you want to create a new service, quickly get some idea into production, and now you've got to get a message queue in there too. So that was what we did was we put the logic inside the octopus with all of the retry stuff. So each of those services, all they had was an API, and the octopus would ping it. And if they didn't reply in a certain amount of time or if the message failed, the octopus would retry it. So all of that was centralized, and we minimized the cost to each of those downstream services. There was still some cost, because GDPR is like that. It's going to bite you a lot, and you're going to have to pay some costs. The other thing I said was, because that contract that all of those downstream services were coupled to, there's often this idea that we can just build stuff and iterate it. Just build some code, deploy it, iterate it, which is great, except when someone depends on it, because then you can't iterate it. And in this example, and examples in the UK government, we had more than 10 teams. And it's like the team in the middle who own the octopus thing, they're like, we've got to switch to a new version by this date. And you've got all of these teams saying, no, 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 no. We've got like massive deadlines, end of the financial year and stuff like this. We just can't switch to your new version. And so the team managing the octopus, they're stuck in this political war where they need to get their stuff done, and all these other teams are like, we just can't, we're too busy. Does that make sense?
Largely. No.
Give me a percentage.
No, we're probably 17 and a half.
17?
No, okay. It's interesting because the examples are always really useful for understanding heuristics, right? So what is first of all, why is GDPR a separate context versus something that each of those teams didn't just implement kind of on their own and send messages out to capture the audit logs? That's one of the answers I know.
I think in this example, it just made it easy to have it in one place, a centralized console, with the audit log in one place. So a business person, for example, can log in and check, this customer asked for their data to be deleted. Can I see it? And I think when we looked at this, that was the simplest possible solution. We didn't want every team having to re-implement all of this stuff. So keeping it in one place, that seemed like clearly the obvious solution to us, but maybe we can talk if you did it a different way. I'm not saying you're wrong.
No.
He's wrong. Joking.
But the other thing that's really interesting is
The other thing that's really interesting is the program management aspect of that. Because I live in Silicon Valley, I know people at Twitter and a lot of places that at scale have this problem, right? I mean, you can't be next to the user in every team. It just is impossible if you work at Google or Facebook or anywhere. So I guess the question is, how did you solve that problem within the government agency? Was it program management that had to, or some other form of priority resolution? Because the business in the end has to be able to answer the question. Those autonomous teams can never answer the question of the mutual priority between them.
That story does not have a happy ending, unfortunately. That problem hasn't been solved even yet, to my knowledge, so I don't have an answer there. But I can think about some other examples and talk to you later.
That's time. Squeeze one more.
I just wanted to mention another example of the octopus context where it is in fact a good practice and not an anti-pattern, which would be something like a customer support tooling, where you want to reach into different bound contexts to be able to manage stuff and change stuff, but with as little as possible impact on those contexts.
Yeah, so I think that's a general heuristic here. When you have a large number of dependencies, try and centralize as much of that as you can to minimize affecting those downstream teams.
It could be an anti-pattern.
Yeah, it could also be an anti-pattern. I mean, dependencies reduce autonomy. So we're trying to reduce dependencies all of the time. Thanks.
Thanks, Laurent.